Hello, I'm Dojo. I'm 30 years old and have a bachelor's in sequential art. I've been working for Tapas about 2 years now as a colorist and typesetter, and before that I was a web designer and freelance artist. I'm currently the colorist on many Tapas series such as Witch's Throne, 5 Suits, Whispers of the True King, and Magical Boy. The majority of my inspiration comes from cartoons and video games, with some of my biggest being Don Bluth films, the Monkey Island series, Danganronpa, Fullmetal Alchemist, and Majora's Mask. When I was a kid, we had the player's guide for a few of the games we owned, and I used to just copy the illustrations from it to the best of my ability. These days I have a folder titled Imitation Crab that I use to store images that I love, that I use for inspiration when I'm feeling stuck. Although I don't copy others' work anymore, I'll sometimes open a bunch of illustrations that feel particularly inspiring at the moment and try to mimic some of what they're doing, which almost always manages to get me out of a rut. I would describe my style as a blend of Western cartoons and anime, and pointy, very pointy. Some challenges I face when illustrating and coloring are that I have a very hard time not getting carried away with details in my illustrations. I have to force myself to not go all out with things I draw, otherwise I'll never finish anything. For coloring, a lot of the time the artist I'm working with already has a palette in mind, but when I do get to pick the palette myself, I have to consider what series I'm working on and whether the colors I'm choosing suit it or not. For example, I wouldn't use the 5 Suits palette on Witch's Throne, and I wouldn't use the palette I use for my own series, Paisley Brickstone, on any of the series I currently work on for Tapas. It wouldn't look right. While usually what colors I think are best for a series come pretty easily, there have been times I've gone back and changed a color 3 or 4 times because it didn't feel quite right. And speaking of color palettes, when picking the colors I'm going to use, I use a combination of photo reference and resource sites like colorlovers.com, spelled the British way, and colorpalettes.net, spelled the American way. But when I've got a couple very specific colors, I'll pop them into a program I have called the Color Tool. It's a really handy program that lets you stick specific colors in and link them together to see what kind of gradient you'll get between them. Some advice I'd give to anyone interested in becoming a colorist is not pinholding yourself into one coloring style. Get comfortable with experimentation and using a variety of different coloring styles and palettes. Most of the time the artists I've worked with already had an idea of what they wanted the coloring to look like, regardless of whether I'd come in at the beginning or middle of a project. There's a lot of collaboration involved with the process and being able to adapt. And one more bit of advice before I close this: do not let rejection stop you. Don't let a publisher's rejection of your work stop you from creating. Don't let an audience's rejection of your work stop you from creating. And don't let your rejection of yourself stop you from creating. Just keep pushing yourself and keep improving, and you'll eventually get there, even if it takes a few years with several breaks in between. Keep your head high and keep on creating. Dojo out.